It's just gone 2 a.m. and a security camera in a small village captures something absolutely sinister.
I think only the monsters live. Only the monsters. Only the most psycho of psychos. Only the most evil dog-eat-dog people.
If you see another person that looks identical to you, run away and hide.
Throughout time, some brothers and sisters have taken their bond to a dark level, committing shocking crimes and leaving a trail of terror in their wake. From cases like the Menendez brothers that shocked the world, to disturbing crimes carried out by siblings you've probably never heard of, these are evil siblings in history you pray you never encounter. The Menendez brothers case is one of the most infamous crime cases of the 90s, and it's easy to see why. It's incredibly shocking and disturbing. It was receiving all this media attention at the time as one of the most notorious trials of the decade. Then the O.J. Simpson case came around and the Menendez brothers kind of faded out of the public eye. For those who are unfamiliar though, Lyle and Eric Menendez had a pretty privileged upbringing in Beverly Hills, but then they killed their parents. Of course, they denied this, saying that armed robbers were responsible, but authorities soon started getting suspicious of them after they started noticing all the fancy stuff the brothers were buying with their inheritance money they received from their late parents, which was quite sizable. Eventually, they confessed to having killed their parents, saying they'd wanted to escape their father's overly controlling behavior and high standards. In court, the defense argued that the brothers had suffered horrible mistreatment at the hands of their parents. The prosecution argued that this was pure fabrication and that they'd taken their parents' lives in order to receive their father's multi-million-dollar estate. It took 2 trials before the brothers were finally put to justice, receiving life imprisonment for their crimes. What you're seeing here is an interview with the Kray twins, 2 of England's most notorious criminals. You know, you're famous when Tom Hardy plays you in a biopic. But yeah, this is an actual interview with the gangsters just 2 years before they were incarcerated. Ronnie and Reggie Kray were notorious gangsters in London during the 50s and 60s. They ran a violent group known as The Firm, which operated in the East End of London. At the time, they were also successful nightclub owners, hosting celebrities like Judy Garland and Frank Sinatra. The Krays earned the nickname Britain's Godfathers, being involved in various criminal activities including extortion, armed robbery, arson, hijacking, you name it. They were known for their brutal tactics and worked together seamlessly, almost like they could read each other's minds during fights. In 1968, police finally arrested them for the killings of Jack the Hat McVitie and George Cornell. After their conviction, both brothers were sent to prison. Ronnie died from a heart attack in 1995, while Reggie passed away from cancer in 2000. In the early hours of June 30th, 2014 in Fresno, California, twin brothers Gerald and Jared Smith approached a 35-year-old woman. After asking her for money, she said she didn't have any, so they began ruthlessly attacking her. Then a 49-year-old homeless passerby named Nathan Halstead pulled over on his bike and tried to intervene. Instead of stopping, the twins just turned their aggression towards him. For several minutes, they attacked Halstead, leaving him unconscious on the ground. Then a driver approached the scene and attempted to help Halstead. In response, the Smith twins then targeted this driver as well, and amid all this chaos, a third vehicle came along, swerving to avoid Halstead's bike, but unfortunately ended up hitting Halstead, who was lying in the lane. The twins then fled the scene. The investigation led to the collection of fingerprints from a vehicle, which revealed that Gerald Smith had touched the hood during the altercation. Both twins were arrested shortly thereafter. They were convicted in 2019, but could potentially be released as early as 2026. On April 1st of 1990, the quiet town of South Dakota was shaken when an 85-year-old Walter Gibbs was found dead in his home. Now, at first it was thought he died of natural causes, but about a year later, authorities received a tip that turned the case on its head. Darlene Phillips, a 46-year-old woman serving time in prison, was reportedly bragging about having killed Gibbs, and this was not out of the realm of possibility. Darlene had a history with Gibbs. They'd been married and divorced twice, and just months before his death, she'd tried to set his house on fire, so it wasn't like she was just bragging for the sake of it. Police would exhume Gibbs' body, and on closer inspection it looked like he had been killed. But Darlene's then husband, Jerome Phillips, eventually confessed to the crime. He said that he smothered Gibbs with a pillow while Darlene held down his legs, all while Darlene's twin sister, Dolores Christensen, was hanging out in the next room, knowing full well what was going on. And why was she cool with it? Well, it turned out Dolores was the beneficiary of Gibbs' will. Both sisters had actually been married to Gibbs at one point or another and had divorced him more than once, which is really weird. Imagine divorcing someone and then marrying an identical version of them. I mean, wouldn't you just want something new? And then doing it like twice over too. Very bizarre case. Anyway. On September 29th of 2001 in Penrose, Colorado, 24-year-old Joel Stovall was arrested for killing his neighbor's dog. Sheriff's Deputy Jason Schwartz responded to the call and placed Joel in the back of his police car. Joel's twin brother, Michael, was also arrested after making threats. Unfortunately, Michael had not been properly searched before being placed in the cruiser, and as they drove toward the police station, Michael freed himself with a pair of handcuff keys that he'd hidden in his pocket, pulled out a firearm, and shot at Deputy Schwartz. The twins fled to a nearby town where they had a rented trailer loaded with weapons and ammo. 2 police officers arrived at the trailer, and then the twins started opening fire on the officers. One officer was left paralyzed after the confrontation. The brothers then stole a truck and led police on this high-speed chase. They kept firing at the pursuing officers while throwing stuff out of the back of the truck to slow them down. Eventually, the Stovall brothers ran over road spikes and encountered a police roadblock, but that still wasn't enough to stop them. They managed to escape into the nearby mountains. A massive manhunt was launched, but one day later, the twins ended up turning themselves in. 1 police officer was dead now, 18 others were injured. They were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. On the evening of August 17, 1993, a police officer in Salem, Oregon responded to a wellness call after an elderly couple, Richard and Grace Remy, hadn't answered their door. The officer entered the home to find both Richard and Grace dead. Shortly after, 2 young twins named Liddell and Lacelle White were arrested. Living nearby, they had a history of criminal behavior that included harassment, burglary, and SA. First, they were sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, but because of their young age, the punishment was later deemed cruel and unusual, and they can apply for parole as early as 2048. On May 22nd of 1998, a man named Jack Wilson returned to his home in Huntsville, Alabama to find an intruder waiting for him. The intruder brutally attacked him with a baseball bat before jabbing him with a blade. A week later, a carpenter named James White was arrested and charged in connection with Jack's death. Shortly after, both Jack's wife, Betty Wilson, and her twin sister, Peggy Lowe, were also arrested. As the investigation unfolded, the attacker, James White, confessed that he was having an affair with Peggy, who was already married. Although Peggy didn't want anything to happen to her husband, she did tell James that her sister Betty was married to Jack Wilson and had apparently wanted something bad to happen to him so that he'd be out of the way. According to White, he was hired to handle the problem that was Jack, and claimed he was promised $2,500 up front and an additional $2,500 after the act was carried out. Both Betty and White were convicted and received life sentences. Peggy maintained her innocence though and argued that White was mentally unstable and that she hadn't even been having an affair with him. The Spahalski twins just could not stay out of trouble to save their lives. There's almost nothing these two didn't do. Stephen and Robert Spahalski grew up doing crimes together. By the time they were 18, they were doing armed robberies. One of these robberies went wrong, and Stephen ended up killing the store owner. He was sentenced to life in prison. But Robert's life didn't get any better now that he didn't have his partner in crime. In fact, it got way worse. He got into several illicit substances and started working in what's referred to as the oldest profession. Google that if you need to. Starting in 1973, he'd be in and out of prison for all sorts of things. And then starting in 1990, things got really bad. He killed a woman named Maureen Armstrong, a fellow worker of the night. A few months after that, he strangled his girlfriend. Then in 1991, he took the life of one of his male clients. It wasn't until 2005 that he'd kill again though, when he beat his girlfriend's neighbor to death after hallucinating that she'd turned into a demon. Obviously, he was not sober at the time. After sobering up though, he turned himself in, also confessing to the other killings years before. He received a 100-year prison sentence. The Carr brothers, Reginald and Jonathan, were responsible for a horrific crime spree in Wichita, Kansas in December of 2000. Over 6 days, they committed a series of violent acts that shocked the community. It all began on December 8th when they robbed a 23-year-old assistant baseball coach. This was just the start of the rampage though. 3 days later, on December 11th, the brothers escalated their crimes by fatally wounding a 55-year-old cellist during a carjacking. Their most disturbing act occurred on December 14th though, when they broke into a home where 5 young adults were gathered. After robbing the house of valuables, they subjected the victims to horrific torment. The brothers forced them to withdraw money from ATMs, draining their bank accounts, and after that, they took the lives of the 5 victims at a secluded soccer complex on the outskirts of Wichita. Amazingly though, one of these victims, Holly G., managed to survive and later identified the brothers. The Carrs had fired at the back of their victims' heads, but a plastic hair clip Holly had been wearing deflected the bullet, and she survived. The Carr brothers were caught and are now on death row at the El Dorado Correctional Facility. In 2008, an argument between 2 brothers over inheritance money turned deadly. 50-year-old David P. Hett was found dead in his home in South Carolina by his friend. He'd received blunt force trauma to the head. He also had several defensive wounds on his arms and hands. Turned out his attacker had been his very own brother, Paul Richard Hett. Turned out they'd gotten into a heated argument over inheritance money, which quickly turned violent. Their mother had just died, leaving Paul with pretty much all her assets, and David just received $1. Ouch, I can see why an argument may have started there.
The Amazon rainforest. Hardly any archaeology has been done there, and yet we know from LiDAR surveys that there are enormous structures under that canopy. The possibility of a lost civilization and presenting the evidence for a lost civilization. But ultimately, when you talk of a lost civilization, how did it become lost? What happened that took it away, that obliterated it from human memory?
Towers made from hundreds of Aztec skulls, Neanderthal remains fused with cave rocks, and the remains of people once thought to be vampires. These are some of the most dark and disturbing ancient discoveries made by archaeologists in history. How wild does this look? This is the skeleton of a prehistoric man that's grown into the cave where he died. Gnarly. He was later dubbed the Altamura Man, but who was he? Well, the Altamura Man is actually the most complete Neanderthal fossil ever discovered. In 1993, cave explorers came across the bones in the Lamalunga cave near Altamura, Italy. They found an upside-down human skull embedded in rock, along with many other bones. The skull was covered in shiny mineral deposits known as coralloid. This gave them some indication of how old the remains were. Scientists believe the Altamura Man fell into a sinkhole and got trapped. Obviously, he never managed to escape. Over time, calcium deposits in cave formations sealed his body, turning it into a kind of natural tomb. Researchers eventually concluded that the remains were about 130,000 to 172,000 years old, making this one of the oldest Neanderthal fossils ever found. 2 Dutch artists, Adrie and Alphonse Kennis, reconstructed what the Altamura Man likely looked like, which was probably something like this. Jamestown, established in 1607, was England's first permanent settlement in North America. From the start, things weren't easy. The colonists battled harsh conditions, disease, and food shortages. One of the darkest periods was the winter of 1609 to 1610, known as the Starving Time. During this season, many settlers couldn't find enough food, and about 75% of them died. To survive, those who lived resorted to eating whatever they could, including each other. Now, there have been all kinds of creepy and bizarre things discovered at this site over the years, but one of the most grim was in 2012, when archaeologists came across the bones of a young girl. The bones were covered in marks that had clearly been left by blades, as if she'd been cut up and eaten like a steak. And a series of other human remains were found in a kitchen cellar, mixed in with various animal bones. Most dated back to the starving time, so it was highly likely these poor folks had been eaten. Well, these folks look comfy, don't they? These are called fire mummies, human remains stored in a very specific way, a way that actually does make a lot of sense for saving space, but sounds pretty gruesome when described. The fire mummies of the Philippines, or the Kabayan mummies, are found in the mountain slopes of Kabayan in the northern Philippines, dating back as far as 2000 BCE. The mummies were created by the Ibaloy people, who would store them in caves. As for the mummification process, it would actually start while the person was still alive. Now, this wasn't a punishment kind of thing or anything like that. It would be done when someone was right on the verge of death. They'd drink a very salty beverage to prepare their body. After death, the body would be washed and positioned upright over a fire to dry out all the fluids. To further preserve the body, smoke from tobacco would be blown into the mouth to dry out the internal organs, and various herbs would be rubbed into the skin. Finally, the mummy would be crammed into a small pinewood coffin and laid to rest. It may seem kind of creepy to many of us today, imagining being crunched up in this position in death, but again, it is great for storage. You don't usually think of gladiator bones being found anywhere outside of Rome, but in 2010 an entire gladiator grave was unearthed in Britain. Excavations led by the York Archaeological Trust in 2010 uncovered 80 skeletons dating back to the 1st to 4th century CE. Most of these remains were male, robust, and taller than average. Most disturbingly, a lot of the men had their heads separated from their bodies, either having them placed in their hands or between their knees. Pretty gruesome. But it appeared as if they'd been buried with respect. Forensic analysis revealed bite marks on one skeleton, which had probably been made by a lion, tiger, or bear, another clue they'd been gladiators fighting in an arena with wild animals. A lot of the skeletons also had one arm significantly stronger than the other, a sign of intense weapons training from a very young age. The findings came from the Driffield Terrace site, where excavation had began in 2004. Dr. Michael Wysocki from the University of Central Lancashire stated, "These are internationally important discoveries. We don't have any other potential gladiator cemeteries with this level of preservation anywhere else in the world." Look at this poor fella. In 2014, archaeologists in Bulgaria found these remains at a 13th century Thracian site, the remains of a man who had been staked as a vampire. The skeleton belonged to a man who was likely in his 40s at the time, and an iron rod had been driven through his chest to prevent him from rising from the dead. His left leg had also been removed and placed beside his body, just to make sure he wouldn't be able to walk around if he did manage to de-stake himself. During the period these bones were dated, many Eastern European cultures believed that vampires were a very real danger, particularly when it was someone who died under what was deemed an unusual circumstance. So to protect the living, communities would stake bodies to make sure they wouldn't come back. This isn't the only corpse found to have been a so-called vampire burial. Far from it. Remains have been found across Bulgaria and other parts of Europe. At a site in Poland, archaeologists found remains of people buried with a sickle placed over their throat so that if they rose from the dead, they'd lob off their own heads as they sat up. And there's something very cartoony, very Looney Tunesy about that method, in a definitely more grim, macabre sort of way. In 2012, in the small village of Bergheim, France, archaeologists found an ancient pit filled with human bones, specifically arms, hands, and fingers. This pit, known as Pit 157, is about 5 feet wide and 6.5 feet deep, and it dates back nearly 6,000 years. The excavation began when an archaeological company was conducting surveys ahead of construction work in the area. While exploring a 5-acre site filled with ancient storage pits called silos, they discovered a total of 60 silos, 14 of which contained human bones. Pit 157 stood out because it was nearly filled with human remains, unlike the others, which were mostly empty or had different types of artifacts. The bones found in the pit included at least 7 upper limbs from different people. Shortly after these limbs were discarded, the bodies of 7 other individuals were also thrown into the pit. As for exactly what happened here, that's a mystery. Who killed these people? Why were their arms removed? Unfortunately, the answers to those questions have been lost to time. Not only was the Krakatoa volcano eruption of 1883 incredibly deadly, it also produced the loudest sound ever heard by human ears. People 3,000 miles away described it sounding like cannon fire. Here's a piece of audio recording of what it likely would have sounded like, not that we can mimic the actual intensity. The eruption began on May 20th and continued until October 21st. The most catastrophic moment, though, came on August 27th, when over 70% of the island and surrounding areas were obliterated. The eruption claimed at least 36,417 lives, mostly due to the tsunamis that it triggered. The explosive force was so great that it caused waves up to 120 feet high, devastating coastal towns and changing some landscapes permanently. The consequences extended far beyond Indonesia. The ash cloud affected weather patterns worldwide. The creepiest part, though, are the stories that surfaced in the months and years following this eruption. Large fields of pumice, a lightweight volcanic rock, floated across the Indian Ocean, and many of these pumice rafts carried human skeletons. One story goes that in July of 1884, students at a mission school in Zanzibar playing at the beach discovered black volcanic stones washing ashore. As they went to get a closer look, they were horrified to find human bones mixed in among the stones. Turned out skeletons had been washing up along the southeastern coast of Africa for almost a year after the eruption. In 2016, archaeologists excavating an ancient Greek cemetery discovered the remains of at least 80 skeletons found in a mass grave. These skeletons date back to between the 8th and 5th century BCE and were shackled by iron cuffs around their wrists. It looked like they'd been victims of a mass execution. The site is part of the Phaleron Delta Necropolis, an ancient burial ground that was uncovered during construction for a new National Opera House and library in downtown Athens. The head of the excavation stated at the time that they were, quote, executed, all in the same manner, but that they were buried with respect. So the question is, who were these folks? Why were they taken out, and why were they buried with such care? Most of the skeletons belonged to very young people who appeared to be in good health at the time of their deaths as well. Is this a death metal album cover, or is this an actual archaeological find? Well, you clicked the video, you know the answer. Yes, this is a real wall of human skulls constructed by the ancient Aztecs. Archaeologists from Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History came across a tower filled with 119 human skulls while restoring a building on the site of the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. This tower is believed to be one of the 7 that once stood in this ancient city, located near the ruins of the Templo Mayor, a religious center dedicated to the Aztec gods of war and rain. Researchers first thought the skulls belonged mainly to defeated male warriors, but more recent analysis revealed that some of these skulls belonged to women and youths as well. Archaeologist Barrera Rodriguez said that while some of the skulls may have belonged to warriors, others could have been from people used in sacrificial ceremonies. In Aztec culture, human sacrifices were viewed as necessary acts to sustain the gods and, by extension, protect the universe itself. Rukpind Lake in the Himalayas of India has a pretty ominous nickname. It's often referred to as Skeleton Lake, and that's because, for a brief period during the summer, the frozen surface of the lake melts, revealing hundreds of human skeletons lying at the bottom. The skeletons were first reported in the 19th century, but gained more attention when a game reserve ranger came across the remains again in 1942. At the time, the belief was that the skeletons belonged to Japanese soldiers, but it turned out the remains were much older. In 2004, it was discovered that these bones dated back to around 850 CE and belonged to 2 distinct groups of people. Most likely they were killed by a severe hailstorm, as analysis showed that a lot of them had suffered blunt force trauma to their upper bodies. In March of 1932, a group of World War I veterans, known as the Bonus Army, marched on Washington, D.C. They were seeking immediate payment of a promised bonus for their service, money that wasn't set up to be paid until 1945. The thing is, the Great Depression had left people struggling. The movement started in Portland, Oregon, when about 400 veterans, led by Walter M. Waters, decided to trek to the capital. They rode freight trains and walked for weeks, and by June, there were around 1,500 300 veterans camped out in makeshift shantytowns. As more veterans arrived, their numbers reached between 10 and 20,000. Finally, on July 28th, Hoover ordered the U.S. Army to forcibly remove the marchers. Troops hit the veterans with tear gas, bayonets, and even tanks to clear them out. After the violence, Hoover doubled down and dismissed the marchers, saying he didn't even think most of them were genuine veterans. The Battle of Wounded Knee took place on December 29, 1890. Now, calling this a battle just isn't accurate, which is why it's often referred to now as the Wounded Knee Massacre. Nearly 300 Lakota people were killed by U.S. Army soldiers near Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. Till this day, this is the deadliest mass shooting in American history. The attack was part of what the military called the Pine Ridge Campaign. At the time, there was a religious dance sweeping the plains known as the Ghost Dance. Now, I'm simplifying it a lot here, but in essence, there was a belief that practicing this ritual dance would protect them from the white settlers and return their land to the way it was. Some American government officials thought that the ghost dancers were militants, threatening to destroy the government's efforts to civilize the Lakota. The situation escalated when a band of Lakota led by Spotted Elk was approached by the U.S. 7th Cavalry. The army aimed to disarm them. A deaf Lakota man named Black Coyote hesitated to surrender his weapon, and when his firearm accidentally discharged, American soldiers began firing at the Lakota. As many as 300 Lakota were killed. 19 American soldiers then received medals of honor. In 1990, Congress expressed deep regret, and the site is now a National Historic Landmark. On July 14, 1877, the Great Railroad Strike erupted in Martinsburg, Virginia, when workers protested their third pay cut in a year. This would be the first national strike in the country's history, quickly spreading to Maryland, New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Missouri. Workers disrupted rail operations, blocking tracks and halting trains, and then things got violent. On July 20th, Maryland National Guard troops confronted strikers in Baltimore, opening fire and killing 11 of them. Over the next few days, violence erupted in Pittsburgh as well, where state troops killed around 40 workers. Federal troops also hit strikers in St. Louis, leading to more deaths. By the end of it all, over 100 workers were killed across different cities. The Bayview Massacre is another dark chapter in American labor history. It all began on May 1st, 1886, when more than 200,000 workers across the country rallied for an 8-hour workday. Tensions were running high, and local business owners were getting more and more nervous. They urged Wisconsin Governor Jeremiah Rusk to send in the National Guard to try and restore order. By May 4th, around 250 guardsmen had been deployed to the scene. Strikers began throwing rocks and shouting at the soldiers. The guardsmen fired warning shots over the crowd, but they still weren't going anywhere. Governor Rusk ordered them to take a more aggressive action, and the next day, as the strikers gathered again to demand their rights, the order was given to just fire directly into the crowd. 15 people were killed, including a retired man and a youth who'd joined in with the protest. This basically put an end to the strike, and it would be years until the 8-hour workday was finally implemented. Alright, so this list has been incredibly dark, so just for a bit of a breather, let's talk baseball for a minute. One of the biggest sports in the USA. Some would even say it beats out football as the quintessential American sport, but you Americans will have to tell me your thoughts on that down in the comments. In 1919, the image of baseball was tainted by one of the worst scandals in sports history. During the 1919 World Series, the Chicago White Sox were favored to beat the Cincinnati Reds, but to everyone's shock, the Sox lost. It seemed odd, especially since they were such a strong team. Later, it came out that several players had been paid off to throw the series. Why? Well, many players felt like they weren't being paid fairly for their talent. They were frustrated and just desperate for cash, which made them easy targets for gamblers looking to fix the games. The money was just too hard for them to turn down. Players thought they could get away with it, but once fans and reporters started noticing some really weird plays, the truth eventually came out. 8 players were banned from baseball for life. It was a scandal that made people question the integrity of the game itself. The Scopes trial, often called the Monkey Trial, took place in July of 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee. It's one of the wildest trials in American history. A high school teacher named John T. Scopes had been charged with breaking a state law called the Butler Act. The law made it illegal to teach Charles Darwin's theory of evolution in public schools, insisting instead on the biblical account of creation. Trial quickly turned into this national spectacle. The prosecution was led by William Jennings Bryan, Bryan, a staunch advocate for the literal interpretation of the Bible. On the other side was Clarence Darrow, a famous defense attorney with more progressive views. On the surface, the trial was about a high school teacher refusing to adhere to a new law, but this was really much bigger than that. This was a cultural battle. When the trial began, it quickly became clear that the judge, John Ralston, was determined to keep the proceedings as focused as possible solely on whether Scopes had actually taught evolution, which he had. Darrow attempted to introduce expert testimonies and argue about the law's constitutionality, but Ralston ruled these out. The most dramatic moment is probably when Darrow called Bryan to the stand as an expert on the Bible, and their exchange was pretty intense. Darrow questioned the literal interpretation of various biblical stories. In the end, Scopes was found guilty, and he was fined $100. But the Scopes trial left a lasting impact on the country. Tennessee banned the teaching of evolution in schools until 1967. The Great Molasses Flood of 1919 is one of those strange disasters that seems almost surreal. On January 15th, 1919, a massive storage tank in Boston, Massachusetts burst, releasing this giant wave of molasses rushing through the streets. The tank held about 2.3 million gallons of molasses. As the thick brown syrup poured out, it engulfed everything in its path. Buildings were knocked off the foundations, people were swept away. I mean, it sounds kind of silly, but it would have been absolutely horrific, and it was. 21 people lost their lives, even more were injured. In some places, the molasses layer afterwards was so thick that it was almost impossible to walk through. The tank had been poorly constructed, and people were furious, saying that the United States Industrial Alcohol should have been held accountable for the disaster. And it really just goes to show that something as mundane as molasses, if not handled properly, can be absolutely disastrous. The Lemp Mansion in St. Louis, Missouri is often dubbed one of the most haunted places in America. Yes, I had to throw haunting in there. Built in 1890, the mansion was home to the Lemp family, who founded the Lemp Brewing Company. At its peak, the brewery was one of the largest in the country, but the mansion is probably most infamous for the deaths of multiple members of the family, 3 of which took their own lives in the home. William Lemp Sr. took his own life in the mansion's attic in 1904, following the death of his 4th son. William Lemp Jr. took his life in 1922, and in 1949, Charles Lemp ended his life. The mansion then became a boarding house in 1950, but rumors about the place being haunted by members of the Lemp family began to spread. And over the years, people have reported feeling an unsettling presence in the house, along with strange noises and even sightings of apparitions. Today, the mansion operates as a restaurant and inn, but people still do ghost hunts. The mansion has been featured in an episode of Ghost Hunters and Living for the Dead in 2023. The Radium Girls. Back in the 1920s, these young women worked in factories painting watch dials with radium paint, which would make the dials glow in the dark. The women were told to use their lips to shape their paintbrushes, which meant they were swallowing tiny amounts of radium every single day without realizing it. At first, a lot of them were fine, but as time went on, they started to experience health issues like jaw necrosis. That's where the bones in the jaw start to decay. It was terrifying, but even as they got sick, doctors and employees just shrugged it off or just didn't know what was happening. A group of these women decided enough was enough, though. They took their fight to court, determined to hold their employers accountable. Because of them, national attention was brought to workplace safety, or the lack thereof, and eventually important changes were made in labor laws and safety regulations. The New London School explosion occurred on March 18, 1937. It's one of the deadliest disasters in Texas's history, but it's not really talked about that much. What happened is that a natural gas leak caused this massive explosion, killing nearly 300 students and teachers at the London School in New London, Texas. On that day, a lot of the students had been let out early for a competition, thankfully, but about 500 stayed in the main building. Just before 3:17 p.m., an instructor turned on an electric sander, which sparked the gas-air mixture that had built up in the school. Witnesses reported that the walls bulged, the roof lifted, and then crashed back down, completely collapsing the structure. The explosion was so powerful that it could apparently be heard 4 miles away, and debris was thrown hundreds of feet with lockers flying through the air. Parents and locals desperately dug through the rubble with their bare hands to find survivors. Rescuers included doctors, nurses, Boy Scouts. They worked through the night. Nearly 294 people or confirmed dead. Again, as time has gone on though, this incident has kind of faded into obscurity, and maybe that makes sense. According to locals, there seemed to be this collective silence about the event in the years that passed, when it was discussed in hushed tones. But there's no doubt that the tragedy still haunts New London.
Starting off at number 10, vampire killings. So starting us off, we have the supposed vampire killings from the 1800s. Now, spoiler alert here, they weren't actually vampires. Well, I guess I don't know that for sure, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and say they weren't. Anyways, back in the 1800s, people in New England believed that cadavers were rising from their graves at night and preying on the living. So to solve this problem, they began exhuming the cadavers. Now, some kept it simple and just turned the cadaver face down, but others jumped to more extreme methods like ripping the bones apart and rearranging them, or burning the deceased person's heart and inhaling the smoke. Apparently at the time, it was believed inhaling the smoke cured tuberculosis, though I can only imagine it made matters much worse for them. Some towns were so into the ritual that they would even hold festivals during the process and celebrate the exhumation and subsequent destruction of the corpses altogether. So while it was incredibly unsettling, they did truly believe they were vampires haunting them in the night, so I guess it gave them some peace of mind. Next up at number 9, dentures. While today dentures are made from composite resin or sometimes porcelain, during the 18th and 19th centuries, of course, those materials weren't available. But as you can imagine, people were still losing teeth at an even higher rate due to the high sugar diet, attempted teeth whitening, which was really just wearing away their enamel instead of brightening it, and the overall lack of knowledge around hygiene. So dentures were still needed and wanted by many. So what was their material of choice? Well, for the easiest and most profitable route, many would acquire the teeth from dead bodies. Although if you had some money, you might be able to afford dentures made from ivory. Other materials were sometimes the teeth of animals or wood, but honestly, I think we can all agree that none of those sound like terribly sanitary options, considering professional physicians at the time weren't sterilizing instruments, and some didn't even believe in disinfecting prior to surgery. Next up at number 8, stained glass. If you walk into just about any old church, you'll notice the walls are decorated with beautiful stained glass. But what might surprise you is that in some of the particularly older pieces, there is a strange ingredient that helps it all come together. In 1112, a German monk wrote about the process of creating the beautifully colored glass, and as he detailed, it starts off, innocently enough, adding sand and potash at a high temp until it becomes molten. From there, they'd add a stabilizer before coloring the glass with different metallic oxides like copper, cobalt, and gold. But once the glass was cooled and shaped, the small details were added by paint. They made the paint usually from lead or copper and would then suspend it in urine. So quite literally, some of those old stained glass windows were painted with pea paint, which I mean kind of just makes me giggle if I'm honest, but it is definitely a weird ingredient to think about being in paint. Coming in at number 7, leather-bound books. Nowadays, it's unusual to even find real leather on anything, but once upon a time, the leather on books wasn't even from cows. It was from people. Called anthropodermic bibliopegi, the books were made in a similar way as they would now, but obviously with one huge difference. They used human skin instead of an animal. While there are actually only 18 confirmed books of its kind that still exist, we have no idea just how many there could have been all those years ago. Allegedly, the books were usually made from executed convicts, and during the French Revolution, there were rumors that a tannery for human skin was established outside of Paris. I mean, it kind of gives me the willies to think about it, and I'm just glad we've moved on to a different material to bind our books today. Next up at number 6, Minnie Dean. Wilhelmina Dean, or Minnie as she was often referred to, was a nanny in New Zealand during 1880 and was a well-known caretaker in her town. But something was off with the woman, and soon she began having quite the dark spot on her name and career. In 1889, one of the young people under her care suddenly died, as if out of nowhere, and initially it was viewed as a freak accident, but 2 years later the same thing happened again. Now, with 2 minors perished under her care, police decided to investigate further into the matter. After a bit of sleuthing, it was concluded that under Minnie's care, the 2 minors were as she was attempting to take out life insurance on them. Police immediately took the remaining young boy in her care, finding it in dirty clothes and drinking curdled milk. By 1895, the investigation into her crimes continued, and she was spotted trying to flee on a train with another victim in her arms. And when police searched her house, they found 3 more covered up victims. Eventually found guilty for all her crimes, she was the first and only woman ever hanged in New Zealand.
Alright, so this first one is completely nuts. At one point, the CIA came up with a plan to take out Fidel Castro with an exploding seashell. I am not making this up for clicks. I know it sounds like Saturday morning, like cartoon lunacy, but this really did happen. The US government attempted to take this guy's life apparently hundreds of times, and he just kept managing to dodge the attempts. They started getting pretty creative. I mean, they had to at some point. Exploding cigars, a poisoned diving suit, poison in face cream. The list goes on, but the exploding seashell has to be one of the strangest, and I want to say ill thought out. Like, listen to this plan and tell me it's not a bit of a stretch. So Castro was an avid diver, so the CIA rigged this brightly colored conch shell with an explosive and placed it in one of his favorite diving spots. So the hope was that he'd go to this particular diving spot, find the shell, decide to pick it up, not to mention someone else could have dove into that spot first and found the shell. So yeah, this plan was scrapped for very good reason.
Speaking of completely nuts, up next we have a pretty nasty experiment that took place between 1913 and 1951 and involved testicular transplants. During that time, eugenicist Leo Stanley was the chief surgeon at San Quentin State Prison, aka Cali's oldest correctional facility. The guy was a freak. He started off his career by performing vasectomies on inmates, but soon turned his interests elsewhere. He became fascinated by the effects of aging, believing that decreased hormones contributed to criminality, weak morality, and poor physical attributes. His solution? Yep, trading testes. Stanley began using the testicles of executed male prisoners and transplanting them into older men in an attempt to restore their masculinity. Guess what? It gets worse. Apparently so many people signed up for this treatment that Stanley ran into an issue. He had a supply shortage. His solution? Animals. Oh, but wait, there's more. Eventually Stanley got lazy, and so instead of performing a proper transplant, he instead ground up the animals' parts into a paste, and then he injected that paste into the men's abdomens. Procedure count? 10,000. Wacko nut job? Yes.
Alright, next up, spy cats. Yeah, that's right. The CIA also tried to train cats as spies during the Cold War. There needs to be a cartoon about this, I think. At the beginning, it could actually say, like, based on true events. Anyway, it does sound like a Ninja Turtles ripoff, but this actually was a thing. Project Acoustic Kitty was a CIA project that set out to use cats to spy on the Kremlin and Soviet embassies in the 60s. They had a vet implant a microphone in a cat's ear canal along with a tiny radio transmitter at the base of its skull so that the cat was set up to record and transmit audio. Its first mission? Eavesdrop on 2 men at a park outside the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. The mission was not a success. As soon as the cat was released, it was run over by a taxi. Further attempts were made. Oh God, I'm sorry, that's funny. Further attempts were made with other cats, but the problem was they were too distracted to be of any use, and nothing productive came of this $20 million project. Yeah, I mean, cats, why cats? Like, they're just, they do their own thing, man. They're hard, you can't train them. Acoustic Kitty came to a halt in 1967. The whole thing was a complete secret until 2001 when the CIA documents were declassified.
Okay, next up we have another pretty shady dude who also worked at a prison. Oncologist Chester Southam, working at Sloan Kettering Institute during the 1950s and 60s. What made this guy so bad? Well, he has been known known to inject patients with live cancer cells without their permission and against their will. He originally implanted the cells into people who had already received terminal cancer diagnosis, but of course he later went on to inject the cells into healthy subjects instead. His goal in all of this was to see how the immune system reacted to the cells. The answer, not well, albeit the healthy people had better results than those who suffered from already terminal illnesses. Eventually, the doctor went back to treating sick individuals, this time at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in Brooklyn, New York. But it was here that his experimentation was met with resistance, obviously, and it was revealed to the public. The result, a big, fat lawsuit, and his medical license being suspended for 1 year, which was later reduced to a probation. He continued to study and practice medicine. That's insane. What the heck?
Next up, we have nukes on the moon with Project A-11-9. So this was a secret plan developed by the United States Air Force in 1958 during the Cold War. A lot of weird stuff going on in the Cold War. The idea behind this was to detonate a nuclear bomb on the moon. Now, you're probably wondering why anyone would want to do something like this. There were a couple reasons. The main goal here really was to demonstrate the military and technological might of the United States to the Soviet Union, who at the time were making big strides in the space race. It was basically just incredibly petty, but scientists were also curious about what would happen if a nuclear bomb exploded on the moon, I guess. They wanted to study things like the impact it would have on the surface and whether it would create any detectable effects from Earth, but the project never actually happened. It was eventually scrapped because of concerns about the potential negative consequences. People were worried about the environmental impact of detonating a nuclear space, as well as the potential political fallout. On top of all that, though, this just would have been a total waste of time.
Next up, we have the Miley killings, which took place on March 6 of 1968. On that day, the American military killed around 576 South Vietnamese civilians, including some of the most vulnerable members of the community, who had absolutely nothing to do with the ongoing conflict at the time. When the public learned about the atrocity, which was broadcasted in 1969 on major news networks who shared graphic images of the incident, they were not happy. The event became a major controversy, with many demanding the perpetrators responsible for ending so many innocent lives be held accountable for their actions. Platoon Commander Lieutenant William Calley Jr. was given a life sentence, but it didn't stick. At the order of President Nixon, Calley was instead placed on house arrest and then released just 3.5 years later. 26 soldiers were charged in military court, but none were convicted. The war continued until 1975 and resulted in an estimated total of 1.4 million civilian casualties in southern Vietnam.
This next one sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it isn't. Operation Northwoods. So this was a plan devised by the U.S. Department of Defense in 1962. The basic idea was to carry out a series of deceptive and covert operations to create a justification for the United States to invade Cuba. Cuba was seen as a potential threat at the time because it had close ties with the Soviet Union. The US government was worried about communism spreading in the West, and Cuba was seen as a potential domino that could fall. So, Operation Northwoods proposed things like staging attacks on US soil and then blaming it on Cuba, hijacking planes and ships, even orchestrating violent incidents in American cities. Like, the goal was to create public outrage and support for military action against Cuba. Crazy. Luckily, this was proposed, but it was rejected by the Kennedy administration. The fact that it was even brought up, though, as a possibility is incredibly disturbing.
Next up, we have the 1969 Santa Barbara oil spill. The incident took place on January 28th of that year. A Union oil rig suffered a major blowout that caused 3 million barrels of oil to spill into 35 miles of the coastline of Santa Barbara, California. The impact of the environment was catastrophic. An estimated 3,500 seabirds were immediately smothered in oil, as well as countless other marine animals. It screwed the ecosystem. The environment, and the economy. And people were pissed, rightfully so. The only good thing about the incident was that it led to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, which is an independent agency of the United States government tasked with environmental protection matters and efforts. But surprise, surprise, attempts to undermine the agency have been successful, and that is why we have offshore oil drilling, one of the largest contributors to oceanic environmental issues to date, other than pollution, litter. You guys know what I mean.
Operation Mockingbird was a covert operation carried out by the CIA during the Cold War. The goal of this operation was to influence and manipulate media outlets, both domestically and internationally, trying to spin things to promote certain narratives and agendas. Operation Mockingbird was involved in stuff like planting stories, manipulating news content, even recruiting journalists to act as CIA assets. The idea was to ensure that the info reaching the public aligned with the government's objective and promoting anti-communist sentiment. Now, a lot of what Operation Mockingbird did is still kind of murky, but details have come to light over time through declassified documents and investigative journalism. Now, apparently, even some journalists at the time were spied on, having their phones tapped and stuff as well.
And to finish us off, we have the highly unethical detonation of the world's first atomic explosive, Trinity, which was an exact replica of Fat Man, the explosive device that devastated Nagasaki on August 9th of 1945. And Trinity was detonated just 15 miles away from commercial farms as well as residential homes. Oh, and they didn't warn anyone or evacuate anyone in that surrounding area. So in New Mexico on July 16th of 1945, less than just 1 month prior to the events in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they went ahead and detonated the highly unstable and incredibly under-researched explosive, exposing those living nearby to over 10,000 times the recommended levels of radiation. And some of the radiation even reached all the way to Indiana, which is like 5 states over, which is crazy, which is why this incident ended up on this list.
Kicking off our list at number 10, the reindeer gift. We'll turn the clocks back to 1941 right off the hop. When the Germans were attacking the Soviet Union, it was of course one of the biggest attacks in history. Britain and the United States had to send over weapons, supplies, anything really just to keep them afloat, just to keep them in the fight. Now they sent these supplies through the Arctic Circle, that was the only route, but of course it was littered with U-boats, you know, war stuff. So thankfully the British HMS Trident was there to watch the waters, and in turn the Soviets were able to fight on. As a gift, as a thank you rather, the Soviets sent the captain of the Trident, they sent him a live reindeer that the British of course had to accept because it was ill-mannered if you don't. So they had to keep a 6-foot tall, real-life living reindeer on a submarine. Must be comfortable, awesome. Imagine the smell. Her name was Pollyanna and they brought her on board through a torpedo tube. She was tiny, she's the cutest little thing. She was a crew member for 6 weeks, which is honestly hilarious because you know some of those guys got way too attached, you know for sure. She slept better than most, if I'm being honest. She shared her room in the captain's quarters. Again, imagine the smell. I don't know, is it worth it? I've always wanted a baby goat growing up, so this is kind of the closest thing. I'm jealous, I'm weirdly jealous. Number 9, Stalin Photoshop. Deep fakes are getting out of hand. I have no idea what's real or what's fake anymore. To be honest, I'm not even Taylor. I'm actually Olivia doing a list right now, but it's been deep faked so well that you believe it. Modern technology is really making it hard to tell what's real and what's not, but it goes back. Back in 1939, a photo of Stalin was published, and he looks normal. He actually looks kind of great. Some would say he looks way too good. You know what I mean? He was touching up photos as far back as 1939, just airbrushing, just digitally removing all those zits and stuff. Like really? That far back? But even if you got a photo with Stalin, there's a chance that you yourself would be digitally removed. Like Nikolai Yevtsov, for example, the leader of the NKVD. He was in a photo with Stalin, but around 1937, Nikolai was responsible for orders that had over 1 million people arrested. So it wasn't ideal to be in a photo with Nikolai at the time. So he was denounced, imprisoned, and he died in 1940. So Stalin had him digitally erased and replaced in a photo. That's pretty hilarious. I don't know, this man was ahead of his time via Photoshop. How did he do it? How did they do it? No one knows. Number 8, Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky. Nice, I remember this one. I heard about this on LimeWire. That was cool. Heard about that at full volume. This was a huge presidential scandal. Back when you didn't happen every other week and stuff, this was a big deal. It was 1998 and Clinton's White House intern Monica Lewinsky was 22 years old at the time. Yeah, young. When you think back to all this old history, you're like, oh, they were this. No, very young, extremely young. They had a from 1995 to 1997, despite what LimeWire told us. Lewinsky said she hooked up with Bill 9 different times at the White House, and apparently, according to her schedule, Hillary Clinton was at the White House for at least 7 of those times. She's like, what's going on in there, huh? Is that my... Who is that? Number 7, adhesive bras. We'll liven this up a little bit with some vintage history it's kind of funny. It's pretty funny. Let's talk about sticky bras, shall we? What a mess this was, oh my. Back in 1949, Life magazine released an article that caught everybody's attention, obviously. This was news, this was like a new technology that was being announced. It was May 16th, 1949, and the article read, for 5,000 years, clothes have been draped, tied, buttoned, pinned, and buckled on the human form. This year, for the first time in history, drumroll, they will be glued on. What in the world? How? This is witchcraft. How did that happen? Just 1, 2, that's it? That's easy. Inventor Charles Langs changed the game, or he thought he did, in 1949. He made these bra cups that would stick to you with adhesive. This, special glue. This specific adhesive was promised to leave behind no residue, it was supposed to be painless, yet at the same time stay glued on even if you were to jump into a pool from a 10-foot diving board. That was the sell. Yeah, well, that's not true. That's definitely not true. Well, Langs ended up selling the company to Textron later on, and the product ultimately failed. Number 6, nuclear site list. All right, back to the dark stuff. Here on Most Amazing, we love lists, right? I'm not sure if you can tell. Smash that thumbs up, hit subscribe, yada yada, we love it. But apparently the US government also fancies a list or two. Who thought? Back when Obama was still running the show, a report was delivered to Congress, or rather it was supposed to be. The 266-page report featuring, every nook and cranny about the US nuclear program. It was released publicly on the government printing office's website in draft form. Draft form, couldn't have been easier, just a casual PDF that shows us maps with stockpiled fuel used for nuclear warheads. Awesome, right next to your resume. Imagine that, so convenient. How does this even happen? I thought this type of stuff could never happen, right? Well, MIT professor John M. Deutsch said that these screw-ups do of course happen, and it's normal, and this one here isn't a serious breach. I mean, it certainly sounds serious, but okay. We'll just have to trust the government. Number 5, UFOs in the ocean. This video here was leaked in the last couple of years. You've probably seen it, hopefully not. This would be a great day. The footage itself was recorded in 2019 in San Diego. Now the Pentagon has since of course confirmed its authenticity, and the UAP, the unidentified aerial phenomenon here, is sphere-shaped and it's flying at extremely high speeds. There's no exhaust, no propulsion system whatsoever. It's just a metal ball whipping by San Diego, and now we're questioning our beliefs, so that's fun. The sphere vanished into the water afterwards, into the ocean, and then was never seen ever again. Number 4, radar footage. Now normally when we see leaked footage, be it of UAPs or leaked documents, whatever, it's always the worst quality. Like that one, not the best, right? Not quite 4K. It's hard to believe when military footage is poor quality, right? Like how can we see photos of black holes and not even have a photo of a UAP yet, right? What's going on here? Well, Jeremy Corbell, he's here to help. Jeremy? What if he just walked in? That would be crazy. He's not here. That's insane. Jeremy took to Twitter in May 2021 sharing footage of US Navy ships being swarmed by UFOs. Like more than one. Sorry, UAPs. We're not gonna call them that anymore. Now this time we have radar footage, and that's pretty sweet. That's different. It came from the Combat Information Center aboard the USS Omaha. The 46-second clip was originally recorded July 15th, 2019. You can even hear people in the background reacting to what's happening in real time. You hear panic in their voices. These military personnel in the background, you can overhear them talking about how fast the objects are moving on the radar. So, seems very believable this time, right? It's not just a grainy footage. It's like a live reaction kind of. And if he's spooked, we're spooked, right? Number 3, Watergate. I have to include Watergate, right? It's one of the biggest scandals in US history. Right in the middle of 1972, there were 5 men who were all arrested for breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. It was clear that they intended on bugging the place, right? It was fishy, it was obvious, they looked like and spy kids, right? They were up to no good. Now, as the year went on, the election came closer and closer, and all of a sudden, out of the woodwork comes this anonymous source who fed information to Washington Post that the Watergate bugging incident was a massive campaign of political spying and sabotage kicked off by none other than President Nixon himself. It was kicked off by his re-election and directed by officials of the White House. It was a whole planned thing. Now, despite this information leak and it being reported to the news, Nixon was still re-elected. Now, these men were clearly linked to a fundraising group for Nixon, but his administration just kept denying any involvement, right? That's the key. Deny, deny, deny. It wasn't until later that year in 1972 when reporters Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, they came forward and exposed everything. Now we got the truth. They exposed the administrator's role in the entire scandal, how they had an inside source, an FBI agent named Mark Felt. It was a whole thing. This ultimately led to Nixon resigning in 1974, the first ever president to do so. Yeah, that's how you know you got caught, when you have to resign. Know what I mean? Number 2, shadow brokers. Back in August 2016, a group named the Shadow Brokers were the talk of the town. And with that name, how can you not be, right? The shadow brokers would steal cyber weapons from an NSA hacking unit and then proceed to sell them online to the highest bidder. Now, this sounds made up. This sounds like it's from a movie. This is crazy, right? Now, these tools in question, these cyber weapons, they've been used by many countries and many not so great sounding schemes. China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, you name it, these cyber attacks can happen anywhere, right? The 2019 ransomware cyber attack, that's one example. This incident was connected to the shadow brokers. So whoever this mysterious group is, it still remains a mystery and still sounds made up as shit. It sounds like a DC Comics villain. It's insane. And finally, number 1, motorized roller skates. We'll end on a fun one, because, you know, why not? This last one they've been working on for a very long time and we still can't crack it, right? This is the craziest thing I've ever seen working on this channel, so I gotta end with it. Motorized roller skates, what a nightmare this would be. Imagine if this worked out. Even Elon Musk would see this and be like, no, that's crazy. This photo was taken at the Sunoco station in Hartford, Connecticut. Now, context aside, this is an odd one. A guy with a briefcase is filling up at the gas station and he's wearing roller skates. That would look bad today. You would have SWAT teams rolling up if you saw that, right? It's 1956 and that futuristic looking man right there is Mike Dreschler. Now, at the time, he was working for a Detroit skate company, but he was very close to gas-powered skates. They would have cost around $250, which today is around $2,400. And its max speed was 17 miles an hour. Again, imagine that in the closing act of like a Mission Impossible movie. That's crazy. Now, obviously the public wasn't supposed to see this. They feared that it would encourage folks to get creative on their own and, you know, launch their way to work. So yeah, don't make rocket skates with gasoline. Thanks.
Next up at number 5, radiation test subject. In 1999, a man named Hisashi Uchi was a power plant technician and he became known for being exposed to the highest amount of radiation of any human in history. While working at the Tokamura nuclear power plant, after a lack of safety protocols, improper training, and just an overall pressure to meet deadlines, Uchi and his coworkers made a terrible error. They mistakenly mixed an incorrect measurement of radioactive materials into the wrong tank, and as you've probably figured out, it caused a near fatal burst of gamma rays. Hisashi, who happened to be the closest to the incident, was brutally injured and sent to the hospital. Once he was there, it was discovered he had no more white blood cells, so essentially meaning that he had no remaining immune system. And despite being in intense pain with a rapidly deteriorating condition, doctors kept him alive under the family's request. So for 83 days, Uchi remained alive, being used as a test subject for experimental radiation treatment by the doctors, which, I mean, in their defense was the request of the family, but still, he endured several cardiac arrests, lost all of his skin, and suffered brain damage as well as organ failure. One of the last things Uchi ever said was, quote, "I can't take it anymore, I'm not a guinea pig." And then finally, one more cardiac arrest released him from his torture. Coming in at number 4, mumia. Most widely practiced between the 12th to the 17th century, although there were a few cases in the 18th century that pop up, mumia was widely used as a means of medicine in many European countries. Now, if you can't tell by the name, mumia is Creepily, just as it sounds, the use of human remains to fix a living person's ailments. It was believed by many of the top physicians at the time that ingesting certain remains prompted the medicinal power of the mummy and could cure things like coagulated blood, pain, coughs, inflammation, cramps, and even heal open wounds. Now, they didn't just sit around eating the carcass directly. Instead, they would either grind the bones into a powder and drink it from there, or drink an extracted liquid from the embalmed individual. In fact, it was so popular at one point that it's believed the reason there are so few mummies these days is because of the high demand of flesh at the time. Coming in at number 3, James Jameson. One of the heirs to the Jameson whiskey family fortune, Jameson considered himself to be an adventurer of sorts and often traveled to far-off lands, detailing the trips in his diary. In 1888, Jameson decided to head out to explore the Congo, and while there he wrote about and demanded some gruesome things from the locals. So before beginning this expedition, Jameson discovered that the area he was visiting was known to have a population that participated in the eating of other humans. Apparently, Jameson set out to witness it firsthand, which, I mean, why was that his dream? A little suspicious if you ask me, but I digress. According to Asad Farhan, who was his translator for the trip, Jameson bought a girl from a trader of slaves for a few handkerchiefs and gave her over to the tribe to be. Allegedly, he didn't pay the tribe directly, but in a roundabout way, he did sort of pay to have this girl. What's even more gross is that he proceeded to draw and paint watercolors of the gruesome event while it happened, which again, just wrong on so many levels. Coming in at number 2, Cambodian Barbies. You may have been taught about the Khmer Rouge in history class, but if they don't ring a bell, essentially they were an extreme communist regime in Cambodia that held government between 1975 to 1979. They were known for being extremely cruel and committed some of the most horrifying acts of genocide in history, with nearly 2 million perishing under their ruling. Now, during their radical rule, the entire country was isolated from all foreign influences. This included closing schools, hospitals, factories, banks, foreign agriculture. They believed this would stimulate the rebirth of the country, but of course, all it did was send it into desolate famine and poverty. Led by a man named Pol Pot, the people of the country could not forage for food, despite the fact that everyone was starving, and anyone who disobeyed the orders was killed. Apparently, as the people became more and more desperate, they began to turn to folk magic, turning Barbie dolls into smoking talismans for luck. Thankfully, since its dissolution in 1999, all the leaders have been jailed for their atrocities, and the people are freed from the genocidal regime. And last up, in our number 1 spot, the Rabbit Woman. Her name was Mary Toft, and in 1726, she became known throughout Surrey, England as having been the woman who gave birth to rabbits. Now, I know what you're thinking, that isn't possible. And you would be right, but still the story of how she convinced people it was real was crazy. Apparently Toft was actually pregnant at one point, but miscarried, and it could have been this that sent her into her madness. Toft began declaring that she was giving birth to various animal parts, and so her local doctor became involved in the case. At first, everyone actually believed her, as in fact a rabbit did, well, come out of her. And with a doctor backing up her claims, the king and his royal surgeon got involved. Unlike her local doctor, the king's surgeon was skeptical, and after discovering corn inside the stomach of one of the rabbits and hay in their droppings, it proved the animal hadn't developed inside Mary. Eventually, Mary Toft admitted to the hoax and explained that she had manually inserted the animals inside her to make the delivery as realistic as possible. She was immediately imprisoned for fraud, and the medical community was ridiculed for having been fooled. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I'm Kennedy. If you liked this video, make sure you hit that subscribe button, and I'll catch you next time.
Want to see more videos like this one? Check out this video next. It's about mysterious alien evidence that needs to be investigated. These videos need to be seen to be believed. Click the video now to watch this video.
What are you waiting for? Click the video now.